As you entered the church this morning, of course, as you will have seen, you passed under our brand new Mosaic mural depicting the parable of the Good Samaritan. And in our midst this morning we have our iconographer, Nick Pappas, who did almost all of the murals and many of the other icons on the iconostas and so on here in the church. And his wife Patty. Patty is a labor and delivery nurse, but she has spent the last day since Thursday as honorary cement mixer, scaffold pusher, trips to the hardware runner, and so forth, assisting Nick in the installation. This is actually the very first Mosaic exterior major installation that Nick has done. Having been an iconographer all his adult life, he had wanted to enter into that new dimension of iconography, Mosaic. And of course in Minnesota, as we contemplated our portal icon with Minnesota weather, Mosaic is one of the truly durable materials when you have an icon exposed to the weather. And so between our need and his interest, he gave us a special price, because this was his first major Mosaic installation. Now, the Mosaic itself is a memorial gift from members of the church, and the rest of the expenses came from our bequests, our special bequest funds. And so here we have our new mural. It is a subject matter that's a little unusual sometimes. There are, of course, many icons of the parable of the Good Samaritan, but as a portal icon, not that unusual. And the parish council struggled a little bit with our topic, what theme to put there. It's a very difficult shape, it's a long and flat, it's a sliver, and if the images get too small, you could do lots of little fishes for creation there. That was one theme we discussed. One was the dove at Theophany, but the dove is really in iconography never depicted separate from the the scene of the baptism of Christ. It's not intended that that's the only place at which the dove appears, as the Spirit appears in the form of a dove. We thought of doing the 12 apostles, but of course we already have them here on the wall right behind us and elsewhere in the church on the columns, because a row of 12 faces would have fitted that shape. We thought of doing the Trinity, which we already have that kind of Old Testament prefiguring of the Trinity in the hospitality Abraham and Sarah give. The shape might have lent itself to three angelic figures, and we're Holy Trinity Church, of course, but we already have very centrally that image in place. And one thing wrong with all of these images, not wrong, but one of the challenges with all of these images was that they all required theology to understand. The scene of Pentecost, the scene of the Trinity in the form of three angels. These are images that are intelligible to those of us catechized in the church. But this was going to be a public icon. It was facing the street. It was going to be seen by many more passers-by with no relationship to the church or the Orthodox Church even than what would be seen by us. And so we ended up settling on this image in discussion with Nick, this image of what is literally a street story. And the story of the Good Samaritan happens on the road and the roadside. And that's exactly where the icon kind of presides, over the face of the church. And as long as our culture, at least, is somewhat familiar with the term Good Samaritan and with the basics of that story, it was a much more intelligible image to have as a public icon. And so there it is. Already we've said something of an East Side reception. A couple of folks driving by, I understand, yesterday, while the scaffolding was up, were honking and saying, "Beautiful!" Emmy, in closing up the hall last night after the event that was in our church hall, she texted me and said, the street lights illuminated. So all night long it has its own illumination, courtesy of the city of St. Paul, and make it very visible and very bright. So that is how we came to celebrate this icon. And on that note, we chose today, among the two gospel readings we could choose from, one was the beginning of the regular Gospels of Luke. The other was the one which Deacon Kelsey read for us, which is the one assigned for the feast that is today, which is the Feast of the Conception of John the Baptist. And we chose to read the Gospel that tells the story from the first chapter of Luke about Zechariah and Elizabeth, because there is a connection, in a sense, a geography, a place with our new icon. So in the name of the Father, and of the Son, and of the Holy Spirit, the things we've sung this morning, rejoice Zechariah, rejoice Elizabeth, these proclaim and tell and unfold a story about the heart of the temple. Zechariah is from the priestly order. That rings an echo with the Good Samaritan, of course. The priest, those people at the heart of Jerusalem worship, crossed to the other side and didn't help one of their own who was going down from Jerusalem. But Zacharias was a priest, elderly, married to Elizabeth, childless. And it was his turn on the roster to come and light the incense in the temple, as we heard in today's gospel reading. And it says kind of pointedly there, only the priest assigned to do that, of course, goes in. That talks about the altar of incense, and this was situated very close to the Holy of Holies in the temple. And that was where the incense was offered. And Zacharias is standing there when an angel appears who emerges as the Archangel Gabriel. And it tells us simply that outside, the people, while he was offering the incense, all the people were offering their prayers at what was liturgically called kind of the hour of the incense. So we have this image of the heart of the presence of God among his people, to whom even the prayers, the people praying outside, weren't admitted to see the Holy of Holies or the actual offering of the incense. And there Zacharias gets the revelation that his wife Elizabeth will conceive and bear this child, the forerunner, proclaimer of the coming of the Messiah. There's a geographic connection between this heart of the church and our street icon. The parable tells us that a man was going down from Jerusalem to Jericho, that major pilgrimage route, commercial route, from Jerusalem up on the mountaintops down to Jericho, down in the valley, the Jordan Valley. That road is a processional road. And we start iconographically when we enter the church down in the valley on the road. And we ascend from that image to the image of the entry to Jerusalem, this ascent into Jerusalem, as we call it, as Jesus, having followed essentially these pilgrimage routes up to Jerusalem for the Passover, then enters the city. So these images kind of capture the beginning and the end of that processional route into the Jerusalem and the temple, at the heart of which we had Zechariah standing making this offering of the incense. It is a story, as we know, of just compassion and kindness. And compassion and kindness that comes at a real cost to the person giving it. And that's popularly, as a street, as a public icon, that will be the primary association of the image. It's actually its most important character as an icon is simply that it tells the parable. But as the fathers and iconographers of the church are wont to do, they meditate on these images in these parables. They know their scriptures very, very well. They see and they read an inner content. And as we come off these Feasts of the Cross these last few weeks, we'll see the iconographers doing with that Good Samaritan scene similar things to what they do when they look at the scene of Abraham and Sarah that's above me on the wall, offering hospitality to the angels. The narrative in Genesis just speaks about the angels. It doesn't say, oh, this is the Trinity, this is God. But the iconographers meditate on it in that context. And likewise, in the Good Samaritan parable, you'll see the face of the Good Samaritan who's kind of having clothed the naked man being beaten up, and he's pouring oil into his wounds and wine in that healing act. Off to the side is the inn, and off to the other side is the donkey onto which he will put this beaten up man and carry him to shelter. The faces are Christ-like. Not just the face of the Good Samaritan. There are many icons of the Good Samaritan, incidentally, where the Good Samaritan actually has Christ's halo on him and is depicted explicitly as Christ. One problem with only that little vein in the tradition is that it calls us to look at Christ only to see him only as our Savior, when Christ himself taught us that when we say, "When did we see you?" he says, whenever you clothed, fed, sheltered, visited the sick or the hungry, that's when you saw me. And so we see a similar face in the Samaritan and in the person he's helping. They both have a Christ-like face. In essence, the iconographers are saying this is an image of the two natures of Christ. His divine nature that comes to save, his human nature that is saved. He's the offerer and the offered. We never depart from the fact that this is just a story of human beings. But behind this image of human beings, we have the story of what John the Baptist came to proclaim, which was that God had become flesh and dwelt among us and taken on that human flesh, that face of humanity in all its affliction. In all its affliction. And so we see the parable unfold. When we look at it with the eyes of the gospel and the fathers of the church, we see it as a theological icon also. We see that inn, it's an inn, but it has a sort of a spirit of being a tent. Because, of course, every church is called a parikia. That's where the word parish comes from. To pariko means to sojourn somewhere temporarily. You're on the road. The fact that this man is on the road from Jerusalem to Jericho makes him a pilgrim. It makes that inn a place of temporary sojourn. We're being told we are temporary sojourners in this world, where we are afflicted, where we have the opportunity to serve and look out for one another. There's even a theological reference in the donkey that we'll get to in just a moment. But that road from Jerusalem to Jericho, it's only 18 miles. But it goes so far down, so steeply down, from the heights to the valley, that there's double the rainfall in Jerusalem. There's a rain cloud that forms as the air blows off the sea and then comes to the top of the hills. Jerusalem gets double the rain that Jericho gets. And they're just 18 miles apart. And as you walk down that road, the vegetation changes. From the kind of pasture, the dry, semi-arid pasture around Jerusalem, some shrubs, some trees. The further you go down that road, the fewer trees there are until you get to Jericho, which is essentially, historically, before irrigation, an oasis. It's literally surrounded by aridness, by real desert. So you see in that image, the scrubby trees are there on the left, on the right. It's barren. And that is the journey. That's our journey. Let us depart in peace. We leave the church, we leave Jerusalem, and we go out into progressively arid and dry places. Progressively further from the heart of the church. But that's where we're called to live. That's where we're called to bear witness. That's where we're called to minister. And that is all in our liturgical, if you like, memory. Yes, we do. We start and go up to Jerusalem. We enter Jerusalem. We receive the body and blood of Christ. We turn. We go back. We go out. We go down into the valleys, into the dryness, away from the church, onto the streets. And that's where we're tested. That's where our priesthood, like the priesthood of Zechariah and those priests who were seen walking avoiding the beaten up person, were tested. And it's all, in some sense, sewn up, and this is where we'll end. It's sewn up by a prophecy in Isaiah. This comes from that section of the scroll of Isaiah around which, it's not the exact text, but Jesus' very first sermon that he preached, in Nazareth, when he was coming back to his hometown, and he had was beginning his ministry before the calling of the apostles. Even it's from this scroll that this text comes, and it begins in chapter 63. I will mention the love. This is the prophet Isaiah. I will mention the loving kindnesses of the Lord, plural, the praises of the Lord, and all that the Lord has bestowed on us, the great goodness toward the house of Israel, loving kindness, praise, mercy, great goodness. These are all the classic Hebrew words that inform Greek and English language of mercy, which he's bestowed on them according to his mercies and according to the multitude of his loving kindnesses. At the heart of that icon, you'll see that the little vessel of oil that he is pouring onto the wounds of the afflicted man, that actually has gold leaf on the surface of the mosaic. We don't want to spread that around the east side. It actually has no financial value at all, really, but it looks valuable. And iconographically, it's the sign that the heart of that icon is the divine mercy. It's why it pours from this golden vessel. It's right at the center of the image. The divine mercy of God. How is that made manifest? In the next verses in Isaiah, we go on and we get a prophetic inkling of some of the ingredients in the parable of the Good Samaritan. So, speaking about God and mankind, in all their affliction, he was afflicted. This is the presentiment, the prevision of the incarnation of God. In all their affliction, he was afflicted, and the angel of his presence saved them. We often see John the Baptist depicted with angel wings because he came to proclaim the angelic message of the gospel. In his love, meaning God's love, in God's love and in his pity, he redeemed them. And then these words, and he bore them and carried them. Those Greek words, aneleven, he actually took responsibility, took them on himself, is what it means. As the Good Samaritan took the man, lifted him up onto his donkey, carried him, ipsosen, the same word we use for lifting up the cross. He lifted up his people in the days of old and led them through the deep, through the valley, as a horse in the wilderness, so that they would not stumble. Because the road to Jericho, for example, wasn't paved until Roman times, in the Maccabean revolt. Even though it was a main highway, it was a crumbly, dusty network of footpaths winding in and around each other. And as the beast of burden goes down into the valley, the Spirit of the Lord caused him, his Savior, to rest. So that you, O God, that's how you led your people to make yourself a glorious name. We see in the parable of the Good Samaritan, in other words, these references to the prophetic imagery given to us for what God's mercy will produce. We are then, of course, told in the parable that the ones we are called to have mercy on, if we want to know, it's not going to be our own kind. It will take a decision to cross the street. It will take some risk. It will cost us. In that parable, we know he pays for this injured man to be cared for at the inn. It's not just in the internet era that we have what we call, these echo chambers and isolated groups and, isolation communities of thought. Human beings are prone to these things. Just think, before the internet and books and communication, how isolated any local community would have been. What the gospel tells us, though, is that if we don't see in the other, if we don't see the real other, the one you have to cross the street for, the Samaritan who's a heretic, is not part of the Jewish community. If we don't see with his eyes that we cross the street to manifest the gospel, we don't understand the meaning of that icon. And so we now have an icon over the door of our church of a heretic. We know that when we walk into the church every Sunday, we walk under, to the Orthodox Church, we walk under the image of a heretic that Jesus himself insisted that the church absorb, saying, the people who do God's will are the ones who really do it, not just the ones who say they do. When we enter the church, we enter underneath this admonition, really, that the ones who did God's will are the ones who did what he did when his divine nature came down to the total other, when it crossed the street, when it came at its own expense and found out how to love and care for, in the midst of great risk, the person who was in need of his love. This is the